Right, so welcome to folks who are joining via the recording. So we have 3 items on the agenda in particular to discuss. So there is a modelling issue, which is a thorny one, but hopefully there's a relatively easy and consistent solution about the transfer of partial ownership between parties, which we discussed in Oxford and said we should come back to this. So here we are back at it. Then for the API, there's the sort of wrap up of the partitioning discussion as to are there some scoping questions as to should things be in or in existing responses, or should they have their own responses? And then hopefully we'll get onto formats and potentially content negotiation for the responses. So if we have JSON-LD, but then there is also other formats, how do you get access to those? Or do we not need to specify that and we just only specify one is the issue at hand. So let me share my screen just so that the recording has something to see. So you should now just all see the notes document. And so this first modeling issue is issue 277 in GitHub, which we made in Oxford. So the issue here is around the situation when some party has shares in the value of an object as opposed to owning all of it, and then those shares are transferred around. So for example, if there were 2 art dealers, and they had 50% each of the value of a painting that they work together to buy it, and then they whoever physically has custody of it then sells it, then they would split the profits 50-50 because that was the proportion of the ownership. That one case is very easy, but as soon as you have anything more complicated, such as either one dealer owns 1/3 and the other owns 2/3, or there's more parties with strange proportions, it becomes a bit more complicated. And then even worse is when the shares of the ownership are then used as payment for other acquisitions, perhaps only internally between the parties. So, for example, one of the 2 50% owners says, "Well, I'll give you another half of my share in exchange for that little statue." So then there is a transfer of 25% of the ownership from one owner to the other. So the result is that it's a 25-75 split. But how do we then document that transfer of the partial ownership between the parties? The other case where this has come up relatively frequently is partial gifts, or incrementing gifts over time. So likely for tax reasons, some donors will give some percentage of the value of an object every year to the museum. So the easy case is you have a painting worth $1 million, and you can only write off $100,000 worth of charitable donations per year. So every year the donor donates 10% of the painting to the museum. So after 10 years, the museum completely owns it. But in the meantime, the donor has been able to write off 100,000 per year as a charitable donation. So that's particularly, I think, in the States, a relatively common provenance scenario where ownership is transferred partially, or the shares of the value are moved around. And we noted in Oxford that while we can say that there is partial ownership by saying there is a right of ownership and it has some dimension, what we can't do is transfer that right from one party to another. And we can't destroy and recreate them because they're conceptual objects. So George is on his world tour at the moment and happens to be here in Los Angeles this week. So we discussed this yesterday and came to a proposal, and that's if I stop sharing that and share my OmniGraffle. Oh, I have to share my entire desktop too, it seems. Oh, sorry. So in this slide, apologies for the rough and ready layout, we have, if I can move them around a little bit, hopefully, the provenance activity. So this is what we talked about in London, and for folks who weren't in London or are new to the course, the idea is that instead of just having an acquisition or a transfer of custody, they would be grouped together under some sort of umbrella activity, such that you can acquire multiple things at the same time, or that you can then have a payment which would transfer a monetary amount between people, or in this case, that there would be also rights acquisitions associated. So the provenance activity is that umbrella. Part of it is the acquisition of the object. It would be from transfer, this would transfer the title of the object from the seller to owner 1 and owner 2. However, as part of the acquisition, there would also be a new thing, which would be a rights acquisition, which would then, so this would be a new class that we would need to create, which would transfer the right of ownership from the seller to owner 1, and then we use the dimension pattern to say this is the 10% right. And another part of the acquisition, another rights acquisition, which would transfer this one, 90% of the right of ownership to owner 2. So this then we thought would lead into the next topic on our next call, or on the December 18th call perhaps, about the sale or transfer of intellectual property. That if we want to have the purchase of the right to perform something, be it a play or just something else, an exhibition, this class would also be useful in that situation, where you're acquiring the right to do something as opposed to the title of a physical thing. So that pattern then, sort of through these ones, would be the establishment of the right. And then there would be, say, there was the transfer of 10% from owner 2 to owner 1. So it goes from being 90% 10% to 80% 20%. then there would simply be a provenance activity, so the umbrella activity that consists of rights acquisitions that transfers, well, that establishes this 80% right, another one that establishes this 20% right, and this activity invalidates this 90% right. So it establishes a new 80% ownership, invalidates the 90% ownership, and then we have, this would have a time span, and these guys would have time spans, of course. So we know the order in which these things happened. So the advantage of this is we have only 3 new things that we need to talk about: the rights acquisition and the 2 properties, and we can either use existing ones or 2 very, very similar ones for the relationships to the owners. And it also works for other sorts of rights that aren't ownership of physical objects. It doesn't need phases, which we talked about in Oxford, as being potentially useful, but not necessarily, or perhaps it's overcomplicating things, which would have been another way to think about it. And it doesn't use sort of group ownership, so it fits in very nicely with the basic case of just there's a provenance activity that has an acquisition that transfers from the transfers an object from the seller to the owner. So it sort of overlays without interfering if we don't have this rights acquisition issue. There. So I've done a lot of talking. What do people think? Is this something that would meet the requirements as we understand them, or is there something that we've missed?
Rob, can I ask, what is the difference between, or is there a difference between right 20 and right, or there's no difference, is there?
Sorry, this is really right 90 and right 10. So that was shorthand for a right having a dimension of 20%, a right having a dimension of 80%, a right having a dimension of 90%, a right having a dimension of 10%. So it's a right, these are the rights of ownership. This is the expanded form, I guess. So a right which is held on the object, classified as ownership, has a dimension of 10%, and is held by owner 1. Is all the arrows.
My immediate question or reaction is I'm not sure about the right having a dimension. Did you? I mean, obviously you must have done that, but can you explain how that's semantically sort of? I mean, how do we understand the dimension in terms of the right?
Yeah. So yeah, indeed, this is the holding your nose bit of it. Right is a propositional object, and as a thing, it can have dimensions. So the idea is then that by having a dimension associated with the right, yes, it's weird. You have to understand it, in the context of ownershipness. But yeah, we didn't. Dimensions are essentially the only way to have numeric comparable values in CRM that I can think of, and particularly associated with objects. So yeah, I mean, if there's a better way to have a real value of 10%, which would thus compare to the 90% at the other end, then yes, absolutely, let's fix that.
I mean, are we hoping that somebody will want to do computation on these percentages? Why don't we just use part of, so split the right into bits and say, okay, this right, which again, I'm not sure that makes sense, but you know, so if you had the right and then you had a smaller right part of the bigger right, and then each time there was a transfer, it was you know, one of the small bits. Or
Yes.
can we? I'm not sure. I need to look at the properties again.
Yeah. So that was where I started yesterday, with a right, 100% right, basically, that these guys were then part of. So the issue, so this. The issue came when you want to transfer things around. So when the second activity happens and this gets invalidated and this gets established, is this part of this and this part of this? At which point it's pretty hard to figure out what's going on, because then you have all of the different rights of the object, the object's ownership as according to these owners, well, it probably is according to any number of owners, sort of collapsing into the right of ownership of the object. And that then seemed quite unhelpful. So then the second thought was, well, what about if we had a different right like this that they could be part of? But now what's the difference between these two guys? And this is just the right as divided up into the 90-10 split at this time. And this is exactly the same thing with just different parts at this time.
Yeah, no, I don't think that what you're suggesting now would work, but the original case where you have the right 100% and then surely when the agreement for this partial ownership over certain years is done, in a way it's like installments, yeah? So you have the schedule of payments, as it were, for the over the 10 years. So every time you transfer the bit of that, you know, corresponding to that year, and they're all parts of the same right, but you don't transfer the right, you transfer the 10% of the year and then another 10% of the year. So you split it, not according to dimension, but according to, you know, 10 equal pieces, you know, call them whatever you like. And then one by one, they arrive from one ownership to the other.
Yeah, so that works in this particular case, assuming it's always 90, always 10%, and there is a, yeah, that it's always a consistent transfer of 10%. If it was 3367, and then it went to 2080, you would need to divide it into 16ths, maybe, in order to have each, and then this person would own, no, 15ths, 20ths, whatever the math works out as. This owner would have some number of small chunks of ownership, and this person would have twice as many, and then it would be a very different set. So as soon as you end up with you would end up dividing it up into 100 different 1% rights, which were owned at different times by different people, and that seems,
yeah,
very,
I mean that was my original question. Do we really need to do it as percentages or do calculation based on numbers? Can we just say we've got 10 bits of this, and this is one, and then next year this is another one?
Yeah, and I don't think so. So at least in our data, there's all sorts of interesting fractions of ownership. There's lots of sixths, So if there's 3 owners and it's not an even split, that happens.
I feel the same way. It is in the data and it is interesting to analyze.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think this guy, the 100% ownership right, that is a real thing, right? These have to be part of something, but there isn't this line. There isn't anything in CRM to connect an acquisition to a right, but this is essentially what that would be. So we could create another right acquisition of the 100% rights jointly owned by them, and then that was split, but that just seemed making nodes for the sake of making nodes. So that's why we then ended up with that as the simplest model that we could find, that still allowed for arbitrary splits of the ownership, and for them to be re-split basically.
I mean, to my mind, the what you're calling split is a part relationship. It is not a dimension. I think it might be a little bit difficult to justify it with the dimensions class for that.
Well, then, so if we had, without using a dot something, is there a way to say the proportion of the parts without a dimension? Like how can we put something here in between the right and the full right, the whole right and the partial right, to say, you know, it's not just part of, it's not just part, it's 20% part. So that would be the direct link. But is there a activity that with something in it, or because this case of 33, 1/3, 2/3, that happens a lot. Not in the ongoing gift, but certainly in just joint ownership.
I can see the problem, but I can't think of a solution.
Yeah, I think there has to be a dimension somewhere, because dimension is, unless I'm mistaken, dimension is the only way of getting a number value into a CRM model without defining something new, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, what other questions do you have? Do you, plural? What other thoughts are there on this one? Lynn, from your experience with with this, setting aside momentarily the weirdness of dimensions of rights, if we can solve that weirdness, would this patterns fulfill the use cases that you know about?
It would, yeah. We had it with the, I think it does. I mean, it is with. Does it also cover the current owner, Rob?
Yeah. Yep. So current owner. Excuse me.
The current owner who has only part of the right.
Oh, I see. Yeah, you would need an acquisition event, which would then establish the percentage of the right. But but there is a shortcut going skirting the edges. There's the current owner property, of course, which is just there's no additional information about what proportion or when they became owner or anything, but if you wanted to find who the current owner is and then sort of backtrack to find when they acquired the right most recently, you could do that, because this guy is of course really just that guy. I just can't draw the line well.
Mm. And there can be two current owners, right? That's why we.
Yep.
That's why we came up with that.
Yep.
Hardly, yeah.
Can I think what Lynn is maybe pointing to is, how do we know who are the current owners? And my question revolves around, how do we know which rights are invalidated? So if we go back to the scenario of a painting whose rights are, ceded incrementally over time, how do we know which proportion of the rights are currently valid?
Yes, so you would then want to go, you would find all of, so it's not as easy as it could be, but you would find the acquisitions, see which ones have invalidated old rights and established new ones that haven't been invalidated, and then look at the time span on this or this activity, and if it's in the, I guess it's in the past because this ended, and there isn't a more recent activity, then that's the most recent right, and hence the current owner that is known by the providing system. This is the rationale for phase, basically, that the easiest way to find who the current owner is to have ownership phases between the span between these two, this provenance activity and that provenance activity. These would generate a phase of ownership. So this one initiates it, and this one, moving nodes around, this one would end this phase. So this phase is the 3367 phase, and then this activity would end this phase and start a new phase, which would be the 2080 split phase. And eventually it would, if it was the ongoing transfer scenario, then there would be a phase which was initiated by the last provenance activity that made it 0, 100, and that phase would be ongoing. It would start when the last 10% was transferred and wouldn't have an end date. So that would then make the who is the current owner and how much do they own calculation trivial, but involves phases.
But the rights acquisition event, that would have a date or a start date and an end date to it, though, right?
Yes, but it's the time span of this is when this acquisition happened, as opposed to how, as opposed to why, the duration of the ownership. So it's the same, exactly the same as a regular acquisition. So you go to an auction and you acquire a painting. The acquisition happened on the day of the painting being acquired. It doesn't keep going. You're not continually acquiring it from that point on until you sell it. That's why we need phases, to be able to proactively assert the ongoing state of ownership, or phase of ownership. And again, I mean, the nice thing is that, as you can see, this overlays easily on top of the already complicated, I admit, model. But so this initial one would initiate a phase, and sorry, this second one would terminate the phase, which is similar to this sort of establishes and invalidates at the rights layer.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, and then the question is getting from this to what is it the phase of? It's the phase of this guy all the way over there, and it's the phase in which that is the split. So there's a little bit more work to do in that space, but it's not. It's not super challenging. Are there other thoughts? Otherwise, we should move on to the API discussion. Thoughts or questions?
Rob, I looked at the some of the definitions again, and I think dimension is perhaps not as bad as I thought. But the only problem with the scope note of dimension is, the property is that it requires direct observation. So I would see that's the only problem, that you cannot directly observe the percentage of right being as a quantity. But maybe other than that, maybe we could discuss the original option.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So dimensions, this class comprises quantifiable properties that can be measured by some calibrated means and approximated by values. The measurement really is just the agreement, and probably, particularly for the ongoing transfer of ownership case, there'll be a contract that defines those things into existence. So I think the observation is indirect via the social aspect of ownership in the contract. And if there is really a legal right of ownership, then there must be something that's establishing that percentage, and that's how the dimension is observed, admittedly indirectly. The other one, so one of the examples of dimensions, Christie's hammer price for vase with 15 sunflowers has currency of British pounds, of some number of British pounds, I imagine. You can't really observe a monetary amount either. Well, you can observe a currency, but I think it's the same kind of issue. Yeah.
And I wonder what the unit would be for that, but
yeah. So Thanasis, maybe we can discuss offline, if there is a better pattern, and propose it on a future call if we can find one.
Yeah.
All right. So sorry, I'm just re-sharing my Chrome. So yeah, let's move on to, or back to, the partitioning question for the API. So in the agenda document, there's this link to sort of the initial thoughts. And on the last two calls, we talked through the principles by which we could establish how to do partitioning, the sorts of things that would be partitioned, and thus enumerated. Here are the partitions. So physical object would be separate from people, would be separate from groups, separate from places, separate from sets of things, separate from our provenance activity, which we've just been talking about, and notably that this response would include acquisitions, transfer of custody, promises, moves, payments, time span, and I guess we could now add rights acquisitions. And so forth. So this is that umbrella activity. Visual work, separate from the object, particularly for Pharos and similar use cases where the same image, visual work, is shown or carried by multiple objects around the world. Textual work, separate again, so the same text can be carried by multiple digital and physical objects. Digital object, so CRM's D1, and potentially digital service, though we thought that that might in fact just get embedded into digital object last time. So I think the scoping questions that we got to last call, observation and attribute assignment. So Thanasis, it's good that you're here because I'm certain that you have an opinion. The question was, should observations or attribute assignments have their own separate interaction, their own separate API endpoint, separate from the object that they are, or the thing that they are observing, as opposed to being embedded within it. So the arguments for separate were that if it's separate, it's easier to be able to disagree with it or comment on it or invalidate it. For conservation, this seems like the primary activity, so to sort of smush it into the object record seems like we'd be doing a disservice to the conservation community. The separate, lots of them. That there are lots of observation activities potentially of the same object, and thus the object record could get enormously large if every single measurement and observation and assignment was embedded within it. Was embedded within it. So for the other case, if we don't really know that much about it, which in collection management systems is typically the case, then it's quite a heavy lift to somehow separate the few observations from the objects rather than embedding it within the object record. So we ended last time with a question from Bree. If we're saying attribution being separate would be beneficial for conservation, would modification be the same? E.g., if there is someone physically alters an object as opposed to just looking at it or measuring it, then that would also be separate given these arguments, or it would be embedded if we don't go that way. And then hence the next one is exactly that: modification, part addition, part removal. The ability to modify a physical thing. If that activity occurs, intentionally or otherwise, is that part of the object record or is it a separate record of its own? I guess Thanasis, I'll call on you again. What my estimation was that for conservation, both of these seem like primary activities that need to be separate because there's a lot of information about them. We want to refer from them to other things and from other things to them. But I am a absolute newbie, and LCD is the area where this really is critical. So do you have any?
Yeah, I think the discussions around that haven't matured enough for me to be able to give a good response. My immediate reaction is that if a conservator was to use a system to produce some results based on this, I don't think that they would expect the information to be returned with the object description. I think the object description would be clearly something basic, and then you would have to look at other things to make anything more any more sophisticated sort of conclusions about the records.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go. Yeah, you're right. I would go for a separate for separate. But I'm just thinking whether this relates to the discussion we haven't yet had about how the linked art model and consequently the API can be extended for cases that are considered maybe in the periphery of linked art, but central for other fields.
Yeah.
So I don't think I'm helping very much with this answer.
No. I think the certainly the first part and the call for further discussion about extension. I think those are both spot on. Dave, Odette, any thoughts? You've already done some work on implementing APIs and so on.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around what the notion of the history of a set of dimensions. Like, let's just say we were recording the ambient temperature surrounding the object, and we had measurements every 10 seconds for 5 years, right?
Yep.
Obviously, we wouldn't want to be returning those in an object record, but at the same time, something like the dimensions or the weight of an object or something like that it seems a bit laborious to have to go and make a separate call to retrieve that kind of information, even though there might be conservation measurements taken. And so maybe there's a more general question about the history of these types of measurements as being, treated a little bit differently than, the quote current measurements or something like that.
Yep. I think the partitioning would be that the dimension, certainly the current dimensions, would be in the object records, such as what I've got on the screen now, which is
the physical.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then from here, if we had, this dimension was assigned by a measurement activity, then from here there would be a reference to the observation, the measurement, the attribute assignment, and thus you could find from this guy who measured it when, using which ruler, or if it was more complicated, using they measured the absolute density using some piece of equipment. Which piece of equipment was it, etc.
So this is more about the link from here as opposed to moving this data into a separate entity.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think we would want to keep the dimension with the thing that it's the dimension of, but then not in this bit of the object record also have all of the attribute assignment data to say who did the measuring, and instead there would be a link out from here to a activity that describes the measurement, the measuring.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm wondering about the example I gave with, the ambient temperature. I mean, it's not something that we have access to right now, but if we were to have access to it, how would the linkage happen? I mean, is that a link to a service that returns the temperature data, or, so in other words, how would you say, we do have this data, but you have to visit this other scope to get there, without actually saying, reporting any values? It would just be what is it, an observation? And
It, to me, and others do please weigh in. To me, it sounds like an ongoing observation that's generating a lot of data. And yeah, you could have there is this ongoing thing that is generating data, and the value being observed is constantly changing, and it's a digital thing. So go over to that spreadsheet or that service to get the data. And so you wouldn't put the ambient temperature as a dimension on the object. There would just be back at the object level, there would be a reference to the ongoing activity of measuring the temperature and its current or past values.
yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. And if we did have an ability to pull whatever the last, whatever a reasonable current temperature would be, then we could also record it in the dimension and reference to it. Yeah, I mean, that seems like a good approach, and it retains the segmentation.
Yep.
I mean, the other comment perhaps to make is that even objects that have been heavily conserved will not have that many analysis done to them. So the observations will not be that many. So even, I mean, if we're talking about linking from the object, there shouldn't be too many links. The case that you mentioned, of course, with the environmental constant environmental measurements, that's slightly different. But in terms of the modification, addition, and all these things, that there are not that many actions really.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was wondering. I was wondering if this partitioning mechanism could be applied only to activities that happen, so frequently that they generate a large data set. But if we think of a traditional case of a painting that's maybe looked at and treated every 5 years, that's not going to create something that's unwieldy, is it?
I agree, and I mean the case about the environmental monitoring, you wouldn't necessarily associate that with an object. You would probably associate it with a space in the gallery. I mean, we did some modeling of the Conserve.io system, which is all about environmental monitoring, and it was linked to spaces in the gallery as opposed to objects. So, again, that would be a very different query. I wouldn't expect that to come with an object.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, that is typically the way that's measured. Although when an object is shipped, I'm pretty sure they include a temperature and humidity monitoring device with it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
In that case, it's the place that's changing, and it's really the experience of the object that you're measuring.
So was that a vote in favor of, well, where are we in terms of should they be separate or not? We want to try it embedded in C, or we want to try it separate in C?
I think as long as we can support the notion of, like, even in the case of place, if you have a large history of data, or a service like that, as long as that can be segmented, like I think Emmanuel is saying, then I agree. I don't I don't think the data is going to overwhelm the response necessarily, but we should, we should probably start there. And if there are cases where it is overwhelming, then we can look to segmenting it.
Yeah. So for observations and modifications, we can try to embed them for now and see what happens. If there's so many that it just becomes terrible, then we'll pull them out. And if not, then we can leave them there. And we've saved ourselves some API endpoints to worry about. So data results is unusable. Great. All right, it is the top of the hour. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to John for taking the notes. And yeah, we will have another call in a couple of weeks' time. Where up for discussion is transfer of partial ownership. So if we come up with a better dimension pattern, then great. But otherwise, we'll pull up sale of IP, which probably will be short. But we might want to, well, we need to push back content negotiation of formats. So next time will probably be more API and less modeling discussions, unless there's questions that come up.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.